Implementation Subcommittee of the Environmental Quality Board. And want to welcome you all here. My name is Sarah Stroman. I am the commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the chair of the subcommittee, or ERIS. I will just note that we have a few logistical gymnastics today that I'm sure will score a perfect 10 on. The first is that Executive Director Nuschler is unable to be here today. So Colleen Hetzel, the Environmental Review Program Director, is going to be filling in the Executive Director role. Thank you for that, Colleen. And the other piece we'll be navigating today is that commissioners that are part of this subcommittee need to depart the meeting today at about 1:45 p.m. We are hoping to return about 3 or 3:15. I know that we will have proxies from our department sitting in during that time. And during that time, I will be handing the gavel over to Member Bauer Kemper. So thank you to the proxies who are going to sit in for the commissioners, and to Member Bauer Kemper for taking over the chair duties. Very much appreciate everyone's flexibility and cooperation here. And again, I'm sure it will all go very smoothly. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Program Director Hetzel to take the roll.
Thank you, Chair. We are expecting 6 voting members today, so I will do roll. I know Board Member Arnold is not here, but her proxy, Jenna Ness, are you here?
Hi, Colleen, I'm here, present.
Thank you, Jenna. Board Member Bauer Kemper.
Yes, here, thanks.
Thank you. Board Member Daubenberger.
I'm here.
Thank you. Board Member Hintz.
Here.
Board Member Holman here. Okay. Commissioner Kessler.
Here.
Board Member Nelson.
Present.
And Commissioner Stroman.
I'm here.
Great. Did I miss anybody? Is Board Member Holman on? Well, we do have a quorum for today's meeting. And then I think we also have our Board Member Smith. Are you also here?
Yes, present.
And is Board Member Martin here? Might be joining us for the calculator. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we, as I said, do have a quorum for the subcommittee, and Board Member Smith, we're glad to have you join us here today. So next on the agenda is the approval of the consent agenda. We have the meeting minutes from June 12th, 2024 ERIS meeting, as well as the preliminary agenda for today's meeting, September 18th, 2024. Is there a motion to approve this consent agenda?
I will make that motion.
Motion by Commissioner Kessler. Is there a second?
I'll second. Second.
Seconded by Member Hintz. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, please signify by saying nay. The motion passes unanimously and the consent agenda is adopted. So at this point, I will turn it over to Colleen Hetzel for the Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Chair. We have a few updates that I'll share with the group today. First, I want to welcome everyone to the meeting. Thank you for being here for our ERIS meeting today. We only have 2 items on the agenda, but it looks like there's a lot of interest. They're great items, so I'm looking forward to a discussion that we're going to be having today. A few logistics for the meeting. This meeting is being recorded, and we do have a meeting chat that is open and visible to everyone. However, the chat will not be kept as part of the meeting records and so this should not be used for anything other than logistical issues. For the ARIS members, the presenters welcome your questions and feedback, and if you are online, feel free to use the raise your hand function or jump in during discussions. You should be able to mute or unmute yourself, and to help people follow the conversation, it's also helpful if you can put your face on camera so that people can see you speaking if you're virtual. So thank you. For the members of the public, there will be an opportunity for oral public comment on each of our agenda items today. If you are here in person, we have sign-up sheets for you to indicate that you would like to make a comment. If you are online, when we get to the public comment part of the agenda, please use the raise hand feature to indicate you'd like to make a public comment, and we will add your name to the list of commenters. You can also identify in the chat that you would like to make a comment. Once we get to the commenting portion of the meeting, we will cue commenters to let them know, and we will notify you when you can unmute and speak. But please be patient with us. There's a little bit of a lag between when we I'll kind of give you the ability to unmute yourself, and then you can actually start speaking, and we'll be able to hear you here in the room. If you need any reminders, you can look at the procedures and guidelines that are on page 2 of the meeting packet. And I will also note that this page of the packet includes information for written comments, which you can also submit to us. Any troubleshooting information can be found in the Guide to Teams Participation, which is linked on page 1 of the packet, and it's also on our website. Just a few announcements from EQB. So this month, we are moving forward with some of our environmental review data gathering and tracking projects. In early September, EQB launched an RGU survey that will go to RGUs when they submit an EAW notice for the monitor. This is designed to help us track more information about project timelines and engagement. We think the information will be a valuable addition to future performance reports, and we're grateful to RGUs that are already using it and filling it out. And thanks to Jesse for his work on this project. Another update is Elizabeth. She was an IDEX student that served with us over the summer, did a fantastic job pulling together some of past year's technical assistance information so that we can dig into which mandatory categories or program issues resulted in the most questions and how we continue to track this information moving forward. Again, thanks to Jesse and Sarah for working on this and finding good ways to continue to track our data. And then EQB had a great time doing some pollinator outreach. We were at the Minnesota State Fair as well as the Minneapolis Monarch Festival. And between the two events, we engaged at least 1,500 people. People had fun playing a bee or not a bee game that Rebecca and Priscilla came up with. And it was a really fun game for everyone, old and young alike. So thank you to those two for the great work that they did. And then finally, we're looking forward to the Environmental Congress, which is already next week. Board members should have all received logistic information sent on Monday to you. Reach out if you think you're missing anything. And then thanks everybody for all of your hard work on this at the EQB. Those are all of our announcements.
Excellent. Thank you, Colleen. Do any of the members of ARIS have questions regarding anything in that report? You can raise your hand or you can feel free to unmute and jump in. Okay, not seeing any or hearing any, so I will just say that I know for the Pollinator Day at the State Fair, Commissioner Kessler, I know you were there. I know one of our assistant commissioners, Jess Richards, was there. I know House Committee Chairman Hansen was there, and I heard very positive reports from everyone. So thank you very much for doing that outreach. Next on our agenda, we're going to move into the substance of the two items on today's agenda. And so first we have Kayla Walsh, our Environmental Review Program Administrator with EQB, and she is going to present the draft mandatory category report for discussion and feedback from ARIS, and this will be before it goes before the full board of the EQB. So welcome, Kayla. second, my computer's trying to fix on me, so. Follow a different path, sorry. No, we're all good. So among the logistical gymnastics that we are anticipating today, we should have probably also anticipated technology ones, because those are sort of in the perfect. Rebecca has done a great job already, and Kayla, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, members of the public and everybody for being here today. Today, I am presenting our draft report on behalf of our co-authoring team for the draft 2024 mandatory category report. And my presentation will follow this outline. I'll talk about the report goals, our writing and information gathering process, provide an overview about how the draft is organized, since it's a little different than previous drafts, and then leave most of the time for discussion and questions at the end. So reiterating our report goals, we first and foremost need to fulfill the legislative intent of the report. So the legislature charges the Environmental Quality Board, Pollution Control Agency, Department of Natural Resources, and Department of Transportation to consult with political subdivisions to write the report and submit it to the legislature by December 1st every 3 years. The report, it needs to include the intended historical purpose of each category, whether projects that fall in that category are also subject to local, state, federal permitting, and an analysis and recommendation for whether each category should be modified, eliminated, or unchanged. And since the legislative intent does mention analysis of each category, we really attempted to do a well-rounded analysis this year. We have many different stakeholders that interact with our program. How are the categories working for you? And how could they be more effective? So if you compare this draft to the 2021 version, that's a big reason. That extended outreach is a big reason why it looks a little bit different. I'll do it. Thanks. Your slide's not advancing. There it is. Awesome, thank you. So our environmental review program is meant to inform decision makers and the public. So we did public outreach in this version of the report. And those results are all analyzed and presented. They were presented in a memo to the board in May last spring. So that memo is what you'll find in Appendix B of the report, and it summarizes that public outreach. A lot of the comments that we received related to the implementation of mandatory categories more generally, instead of focusing on one singular category. So a lot of those comments fit, they had similar themes in them, so we summarized them and mentioned them under the additional considerations page at the end of the report. Some comments applied to the greater environmental review programming, not just mandatory categories, so they were deemed out of scope for the purposes of this report and can be better handled in our continuous improvement process. And Appendix A talks about that. EQB also collected ideas from our co-authoring agencies for categories where they serve as the RGU. Our co-authoring team met every other week for the past few months to discuss the report layout, the tone, its scope, and its contents. They helped us to really balance the RGU experience in the report with the public perspective, because those are very different voices and there's value in representing each. Recommendations are the voice of the co-authors after hearing all of the information that we've gathered from local government units, members of the public, and other sources that we have listed in the methodology of the report. And then finally, EQB formatted it, offered the report to our tech reps who serve at their agencies, and in the last 3 weeks, tech reps have shared that report as needed to internally and with agencies, subject matter experts, so that internal reviewers can provide some preliminary edits to us, and then we have the report, our current draft, in the board packet today. So that's how we've gotten to where we are. So now I'm going to walk through the report layout really briefly. Again, it's updated from the last version. So the full draft starts in your board packet on page 8. So first, our executive summary really explains why we have our mandatory categories and their importance to our program and how to read the report. It explains how Minnesota is seen as a very much as a national leader in this space in having a state level environmental review program. And it's provided benefits for us over 50 years. And we really wanted to stress the strength of our program. And that executive summary includes our next steps where we say what our recommendations are. Our recommendations are ways to further strengthen the program is how we're seeing it. And there are a menu of options in the report for us for how to do that. So EQB will consider those recommendations in future work planning where we can weigh these recommendations in this report alongside other program needs and the continuous improvement recommendations. So the report is providing a menu of options, but we're not work planning inside of the report. And I'll share more about recommendations later on. So after the executive summary in the report, there's a program overview. This was in past reports as well. It talks about our roles and responsibilities in environmental review, and it explains our authoring methodology, including where all of the information in the report has come from. And then we get to the main course. The bulk of the information is this mandatory category analysis. So that as each category has its own header, it begins with a link to the rule citation, and it lists the potential RGUs, responsible governmental units, that would be serving potentially for projects under that category. It links to SONARs, statements of need and reasonableness, which they describe the intended historical purpose of the category. And then we have the number of projects that were completed since the 2021 report in each category. And that list of permits is largely going to be the same list that we saw in the 2021 report. There were very few changes made there. And then each category has a discussion portion for it. The discussion has a little background on why the category exists and what the RGU experience is in implementing that category. And then if there are any public perspectives, they are summarized under that public perspectives header per category. And then under the discussion section, again, we have 10 categories that specifically call out opportunities for improved guidance. And guidance updates don't translate to the level of a recommendation to the legislature, which is the audience of this report, because we as staff can go ahead and update those without a rule change, but they're called out to document where we see those opportunities and acknowledge that we'll work toward that. We want it to be transparent and list them in there. They can be updated pretty quickly after the report is published. But the header of rule change considerations, that explains reasoning behind why the rule change recommendations are being made. That's anything that would need updating in our definition rule in 4410-0200 and in our mandatory category rules. So if there's a recommendation for change, that's the reasoning. The header will provide a reasoning for it. And then back to the outline of the report and how it's laid out. After the mandatory category analysis, there's a page on additional considerations. So again, some of the feedback we've received from state agencies, RGUs, and the public, it really impacted multiple categories and the overall implementation of the categories. So that level of information is documented there. They're not recommendations in the report, but they are important areas of work that we could engage in if the board decided to. So that's why we put them under additional considerations. And then lastly, we have the appendices, which I already touched on a little bit. For a little more detail, Appendix A, it does explain our continuous improvement process, and it gives context for a few areas that could be considered in the next CI process. So those are topics like tribal cultural resources, handling those more effectively and consistently, considering if certain EAWs or EISs could benefit from having what past sonars have called a shelf life and what more current commenters have called an expiration date. And then we also note two very often discussed ideas of addressing cumulative impacts and cumulative potential effects. and then addressing and considering health impacts across environmental review. So we received a lot of comments on those items, and we felt that it was important to document that we hear those concerns and ideas, but they did not directly pertain to an existing mandatory category. So that's why the co-authoring team decided to list them in the appendix. As far as what did come out as recommendations, there we are. Okay. I think important context overall for the report are there are 43 different category headers, and of those 27 have no change. And that leaves 16 categories that have some sort of a recommendation. That could be defining a term for clarity, or a housekeeping fix, or even a threshold change. So the bullet points under that 16 categories are the proposed considerations for change. 4 of them have legislatively directed updates. Those are very straightforward. 11 include a definition update or a housekeeping fix. The housekeeping things are also very straightforward. And then there are 5 categories that do note some sort of a consideration for changing a threshold. And those numbers, they don't add up to 16 because one category might talk about both the definition update and the threshold update. But that gives you an overall idea of the type of change that we're looking at. And then I'll go through a couple examples. So the legislature did direct EQB to do an expedited rulemaking so that our Rule 4410 can make conforming changes to align with the new 2024 Minnesota Energy Infrastructure Permitting Act. We need to make sure that our rules are properly referencing these new rules and statutes that were renumbered and changed for PUC. So an example of that is our nuclear fuel section. It has the recommendation that the EQB updates the EIS category to make the PUC the RGU for independent spent fuel storage installations as directed by the 2024 legislature. And then next, I have a couple examples of categories that do mention either a recommendation for housekeeping or a definition of a term. And these are really intended to provide clarity, not to change the interpretation of a category, but just to provide clarity on how it's already being interpreted. So one example is that storage category. It makes an unnecessary reference. It says the PUC is the RGU except as provided in item G. Item G also says the PUC is the RGU. So that's a circular reference, easy housekeeping cleanup like that. The residential development category, currently we have a formula in our guidance where we help calculate the attached or unattached units. And so that could be written in a way that's more readable and user-friendly in our rule. So again, not changing the threshold, but making it easier to interpret. And the last one here is an example of a definition change for wastewater systems. So we said, consider adding a definition in 4410 0200 to clarify terms like design flow capacity. So leaning on programmatic interpretations of this term to ensure that all RGUs are thinking about it in the same way based on current practices. Great, and then the last, but not least, we have those 5 categories that propose threshold changes in some way. Those are fuel conversion facilities, air pollution, solid waste, resorts, campgrounds, and RV parks and shoreland, and finally animal feedlots. The recommendations here are aiming to increase the scientific integrity, user-friendliness, and consistency of that category and its implementation. So for example, the fuel conversion category, it says in the report, if rulemaking is pursued for other housekeeping items, also evaluate changes to the thresholds in this category to see if they should be measured based on projects outputs rather than material inputs, which is how it's currently written. For resorts, campgrounds, and RV parks and shorelands, the recommendation is to consider beginning further conversations to evaluate the effectiveness of measuring the threshold using a marker of lake carrying capacity. And again, the reasoning for all these recommendations is provided in the report, but I provide those examples just to give you a flavor of how we're phrasing the recommendations as considerations for change and acknowledging that many more engagement opportunities would be provided before we embark on making one of those changes. And then the air pollution category I wanted to highlight just because it does have some more specific recommendations than other categories. So it's asking us to consider changes, creating a mandatory EIS category for air pollution as it relates to criteria pollutants, air toxics, and greenhouse gas emissions. And this is an area where we saw some alignment between the RGU's perspective and the public comment. The report also recommends that we consider changing the EAW threshold in item A from 250 tons per year to 100 tons per year, which is where it once was. And that was also a recommendation in our 2021 mandatory category report. And then lastly, we ask in the report to consider adding an item that would have its own threshold for hazardous air pollutants. So as with all of our recommendations in this report, we provide the reasoning and we stress that this is a starting point for further conversations on this category. All right, and then given the breadth and of the different types of projects that could happen in these categories, we will be putting together a projects list this fall that helps us to make some prioritization, maybe looking at an impact versus effort matrix, ensuring that we can kind of take things on in a pragmatic way. And basically, like the slide says, consider these as opportunities and recommendations for future work planning. Carrying out any one of these recommendations would require a lot more planning and would probably need to be phased to ensure that we have adequate evaluation of the issue, the needs, the scoping, and having proper engagement before moving forward. So the report, again, does not work plan, but we're planning on work planning later. So it only lays out a menu of options for us. And then as far as our timeline goes, we are on track with what I've presented in the past. Today's ARIS meeting on the left-hand side here, that's our first opportunity to hear your thoughts today. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. And then the co-authoring team will go back to the drawing board as needed and make updates and publish a second draft in the October 4th board meeting packet. And then October, the board will meet to discuss the draft and propose any final changes so that co-authors can again make edits and have it ready for a final draft for the November board meeting. And at that time, we'll make a vote at the November meeting, and it's due to the legislature December 1st. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for being here today, for engaging and listening. And of course, big thank you to our co-authors and our authoring team. There's been a lot of really good work and care that's gone into this draft. And so with that, I'll put up these prompts if we need them, but otherwise happy to hand it back over to you, Chair Stroman.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I really appreciate that thorough presentation. And I know that at DNR, we had an opportunity to thoroughly review the draft and appreciate on this. I'm sure other agencies were the same, and it'll be good today to get perspectives from the full complement of board members that serve on ARIS today. So first, we will have opportunities for the public to comment on this in a little bit, share thoughts with us, but I do want to start with ARIS members and get your thoughts on the questions that Kayla has posed on the screen, or any other thoughts you would like to share as this report works its way to a final version. So I don't know that I will be able to see people. I will rely on if board members want to raise their hand. If you're online, if you are in the room, feel free to raise your hand or jump in, and look forward to the discussion from ARIS members. Great. Looks like board member Bauer Kemper has his hand up. I was mistaken.
Yeah.
I can't see that.
All right, good. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kayla, to you and the team for putting the draft together. I have three questions. I'll maybe just start with one. Can you say a brief bit, very generally, about how you all, as you mentioned briefly here, I think, and as we saw back in May, y'all provided a memo that kind of pulls together both quantitatively and qualitatively the public input that came in as part of this process. Can you really quickly characterize how you all as a writing team integrated that public input into the report?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that question. So we did summarize all of the public feedback and put it in that memo, like you mentioned, which went out to the board in May of 2024. And then we definitely discussed all the feedback as a team, and the co-authors deliberated, and where it aligned with, we had some easy wins where that perspective aligned with what we're hearing from all parties. And we were able to put that in the report, and all other, high level summaries of public comment were put in the public perspective header under each category. And so I think, at a high level, that's how that comment was used.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. My second question, I'll put forth right now too. How do you view, Kayla, the relationship between the recommendations that this report is going to put forth and the continuous improvement process? Are those two different tracks, or are these recommendations going to be input into the continuous improvement, or something else? How do those two pathways look in relation to one another?
A great question. I think it's something that we're all still thinking about the best way to do. A lot of the recommendations that we have in this report are housekeeping fixes or definitions that impact a very specific category. So we have to define the project there. Is the project doing all of our housekeeping fixes in one rulemaking session, or is the project specifically focusing on one mandatory category and doing a deep dive into updating that threshold? And so I think once we define those projects from this report, we'll be able to use our continuous improvement process as one way of helping us to prioritize what we want to work on next, and looking at the resources and the projects we have ongoing and kind of figuring out how we can be most efficient in moving things forward.
All right, very good. Appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Bauer-Kemper. I'm going to actually suggest that maybe you go ahead with your third question, and I'm suspecting by the time we're done with that, I will be handing the gavel over to you, and then you can officiate for Member Nelson's question.
Okay, sure. All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it, Chair. So my third question kind of relates to what you've just said, Kayla, and it's a bit tangential because it's about Appendix A. I happen to be particularly interested in some of the things that came forth and that are reflected there in Appendix A, and I'm wondering at what stage in the continuous improvement process are those items? Have they been scored? Have they been reviewed, or are they still at step one of the continuous improvement process, or are they farther along there?
That's a great question. And I would add to your previous question that if any ARIS members or board members have recommendations on how to move these forward, we're very open to that today or any day. But looking at Appendix A, I know that some of these were very high level scored in our last continuous improvement process. And then we will be doing starting over at step one and scoring all of our projects in that continuous improvement process again the next time. So these will automatically go into that hopper to go through the CI process. That's what we're planning on right now anyway.
Okay, all right, I appreciate that, and I know that Appendix A is a bit tangential to the conversation right now, but I guess I'll editorialize for a moment and encourage us to to move that process along, especially in relation to the issues that are the topics that are listed here in Appendix A, because indeed we've received a lot of public input regarding them. And I know they're of interest not just to me, but to other board members. And so I hope that we can continue moving those topics as well as others along in that continuous improvement process. So, thanks. And
Great.
then I suppose, am
Yeah.
I now chairing the meeting too? Sorry.
I am officially handing the virtual gavel, I guess, since we don't have an actual one, over to you. So thank you, Member Bauer-Kemper, for picking up here until I return.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Stroman, and to our other commissioners who have to jump over to the Capitol. We hope to see you all in a bit, and I'm happy to do my best, and I'll ask for all kinds of grace as I transition to the helm here, especially from Public Member Nelson, who's patiently waited for his moment to have this discussion. So, Member Nelson, if you would, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say that I was very impressed with the report, and I want to thank staff for that. As I looked through things, the logic was there that I could follow the information to the conclusions. I only have one suggestion, and that is in the executive summary, if you could add some sort of summary of the recommendations. And for example, slide number 9 that you showed, where you said there were 4 that had to follow the energy legislation, 11 that had housekeeping, 5 that had threshold updates in some sort of quick table. That would help those who are only kind of skimming the report for the bottom line, or sort of looking for just brief bits of information. And with that, I'll be quiet and see what other board members think of that.
All right. Thank you, Public Member Nelson. Kayla, I trust that's a friendly suggestion that you've taken note of and can work toward that. Sounds like a great idea. Other comments or questions from ARIS members? All right, hearing none of those, any comments or questions from other EQB members who are in the meeting? Okay, so if there are no board member or ARIS member questions, we do want to offer an opportunity right now at this point in the meeting agenda for public comment, offer that opportunity to make any comments on the draft mandatory categories report. So if there's a sign-in sheet in the room, we'll use that. And then if you are participating virtually, please raise your hand through the Teams interface, and we will arrange to unmute you and provide you that opportunity. Please, whether speaking in person there or through Microsoft Teams, please keep your comments relatively brief. These should be 2 to 3 minute comments. Do we have anyone who has signed up in the room to provide public comment?
We do have a public commenter called Robert Hale.
Right here.
All right.
You are welcome to come up.
Where do you
All
want
right.
me?
Thank you, Rob.
Okay.
Easier for the microphone.
Well, thank you. My name is Robert Hale. I'm here representing family and friends who have submitted comments on the internet to the comment section. And basically, I'm here to express their frustration with some of the rules that have not been changed. For example, people are concerned with water quality, and they've been looking at the mining and looking at it, that it hasn't been changed in 42 years, the requirements. Last time it was changed was 1982. And there was a small acknowledgement in there said that this section drew a lot of commentary, public commentary, and that's all the feedback there was on it. So I'm here to express the desire for people to know a little bit more. But why? Yeah, obviously you can't answer every question, but generally get some feedback back on the feedback. So you can, so they can know that what they're writing, they're spending time communicating with agencies, they know they're getting some response. That's it. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Robert Hale.
We do have one other person in the room that signed up for public comment, Paul McAfee.
My name is Paula McAfee, and I'm the Advocacy Director and Counsel for Water Legacy. And I just have to say, I'm looking around this room, I don't see, this is the strangest public process I've ever seen, because I don't see any EQB members in this room. And the commissioners have left before the public started talking. I was born a long time ago. And so I'm aware that the Minnesota EQB was written into law in 1973 to be a check on state agencies, so they would improve environmental review and decision-making, not to get consensus of the project proponents and the agencies, but to solve a problem. The original EQB had a ratio of 10 citizens to 5 agencies. It was truly independent. This EQB mandatory categories rules process demonstrates the opposite. Apparently, even one commissioner, one agency, DNR, with a particularly fraught history of environmental review can stifle rigorous public comments and serious analysis of needed changes. This turns what's supposed to be the EQB process completely upside down. I provided today additional copies of Water Legacy's February 2024 comments requesting specific changes in EQB rules. And all of them were either changes to the mandatory section or the definition section as they were supposed to be. Let me touch briefly on a few of the highlights and provide some explanations for why change is needed. First, revise rules immediately to clarify that an EIS is mandatory if the project has potential significant environmental effects. Why? Because the existing rule is badly drafted, and both mining operators and agencies act as if the EIS is only mandatory for listed expansions, and any other EIS, no matter what the harm, is purely discretionary. That's not what the law says. Second, put an expiration date on an EIS. Why? Because the DNR recently denied environmental review of tailings dam expansions based on a half-century-old Milepost 7 EIS, rather than do the analysis to avoid potential catastrophe for Silver Bay and Lake Superior. Third, an independent health assessment. This one is on the borderline. It's in definitions and not exactly in mandatory categories, but it's really important. Why? Because health impacts from the PolyMet proposed mine were scrubbed out of the final PolyMet EIS, and that includes asbestos-like fibers, the health impacts, and also the impacts of mercury, which is what resulted in the reversal of the permit based on EPA and Army Corps analysis. Next, require an EIS for diversion of Lake Superior Basin waters. This is a no-brainer because despite the Great Lakes Compact, DNR secretly approved several years ago destruction of the Laurentian Divide inside a mine pit, the North Shore Peter Mitchell pit, without notice and without environmental review. And finally, stronger categories for mining mandatory EAWs and EISs. And there are a lot of specifics there, many of which we talked with lots of practitioners. Why? To prevent DNR unlimited approvals of mine expansions and tailings basins expansions. The Mintac mine and tailings basin, this is the poster child. They've expanded to a total of nearly 20,000 acres over decades. And that 20,000 acres, that's more than half the size of the city of St. Paul. Never had to do an EIS, never. Now the EQB and these rules were founded as a hedge against regulatory capture. It is not the EQB's job to ask project proponents or recalcitrant agencies if they like the rules. It's their job to create some kind of balance so that nature is protected and the future of generations is protected. In this case, the mandatory rules process, EQB rules have instead enshrined a dirty, irresponsible past and slammed the door on public comments. Today, the legacy of Minnesota's future generations requires that the EQB board reopen denial of public recommendations that would strengthen the EAW and EIS process. For goodness sake, at least let the board see the full extent of the public comments, not just a summary that people were concerned about mining, because there were specific actionable recommendations not to stop mining, but to understand its impacts and avoid, minimize, and mitigate them as the law requires. We call on all of you, and I mean, this is not up to the staff, this is up to the board. We call on you to have the courage and integrity to change course. Thank you so much. Happy to answer any questions. I've been doing nothing else for 15 years. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Paul McAbee. Colleen,
like
do we
to
have
call-
anyone else in the room?
We don't have any others, Chair, we do not have any others signed up for comment in the room. So I think we
Okay.
do have some hand raised. So.
Yeah, we do. We have several. So can we get Chris Wegerson active to address the meeting?
All right, I think we're having a quick technical issue.
Okay. Chris, are you able to unmute and activate camera? Well, it looks like Tony, one of the folks who's with the hand up, is now able to do that. So Tony, we'll go to you if we could.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner and members of the ERIS. My name is Tony Quillis, and I'm submitting these comments on behalf of the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. I just wanted to stress that our members consistently tell us that time, cost, and uncertainty are an issue of concern in the environmental review and environmental permitting process. Because of this input, the Minnesota Chamber Foundation took the initiative and put together a report comparing the environmental review process here in Minnesota with 9 other states. And there are some things we do really well here in Minnesota in regards to environmental permitting and environmental review. But there is one issue area that I'd like to point out, specifically in air permitting, where it takes longer here in Minnesota and costs more to get a permit compared to other states. And this timelines are measured in years, not days, and it hurts companies' willingness and ability to invest here in Minnesota. The PCA, to their credit, has taken some initiatives to improve the environmental permitting review and process, and the Chamber's been working with Commissioner Kessler and her staff, and we're very appreciative of their cooperation and looking forward and trying to find some efficiencies and streamlines in the process. But in the report in front of you today, there are some proposals under the air division. I think it's page 33, at least in the packet that I looked at, that add 3 new requirements in regards to a new threshold for hazardous air pollutants, existing mandatory threshold for air emissions and dropping those tons per year, and then creating a new category for greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, all of these proposals are going to add time, cost, and uncertainty to a permitting process and is going to have a direct impact on our economy. First, it should be noted that point sources are only 20% of the criteria air pollutant emissions in the state, and also 22% of hazardous air pollutants. Everything else is non-point, such as trucks and vehicle emissions. In addition, point sources in Minnesota are already heavily regulated at the state and federal level, and we worry this proposal by the EQB will be redundant of existing laws and statutes. And the existing laws and statutes are already set up to be very protective of the human health and environment of our citizens. Projects with air emission increases above applicable thresholds must already undergo a rigorous process here in Minnesota and include numerous public participation opportunities. In regards to the tons per year of cumulative hazardous air pollutants, they're likely to be covered under what's known as NESHAPs, or National Emission Standards for Hazardous Pollutants, and also be subject to what's known as major source obligations. These are all risk-based and reviewed by the EPA on a regular basis. Additionally, projects that result in air emission increases above the new source review program are subject to what's known as best available control technology modeling and other obligations. These types of permitted sources that we just discussed are among the most regulated and monitored in the United States. Beyond existing state and federal permitting requirements, the 2023 legislature just passed a law creating environmental justice areas and new cumulative impacts analysis within those areas for new and existing permanent air emissions in the state. The Chamber's position is that the proposed environmental review changes are likely to increase the time and expense related to economic development projects here in the state without adding any protection for our citizens or for our environment. If the EQB believes these changes are needed in the environmental review program, we believe additional technical analysis should be performed and address all sources of pollution in the state. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the ability to make these comments, and we'll stick around for any questions.
All right, thank you.
We'll call a virtual commenter, Chris Wegerson, please.
Chris Wegerson, you should be able to unmute. Okay, Chris, we can see you. Are you able to unmute and provide your comment?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for taking my comments. My name is Chris Wegerson, and I'm a family practice physician and member of the Minnesota Academy of Family Physicians. I've been working with a group of physicians since 2014 in order to get health impact assessments included in environmental review, specifically in environmental impact statements. We tried to get an HIA included in the PolyMet EIS. We met with several of the commissioners in September of 2014. When they would not include HIA, we asked them, what can we do? And they said, this is Barb Naramore and John Linkstein told us, change 4410. So we have a petition before the MEQB in 2016 that asks to have HIA in EIS. And this petition has never been voted on because we were told by the MEQB that they were going to be establishing an environmental review advisory panel. We presented before the ERAP, and the ERAP recommended that HIA be incorporated in environmental review. In 2024, this April, we also were involved in the April listening sessions for the mandatory category reporting. So we're disappointed that HIA was given short shrift in Appendix A on page 75. There's only one paragraph related to HIA. So if you look at your continuous improvement, it checks all the boxes. Criteria for information, scientific integrity, criteria for engagement of various groups that historically been marginalized, and criteria for process. So I'm not sure what else we need to do, because we actually have a petition before the MEQB and it's not been acted on. So I think that HIA should be elevated in the mandatory categories. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wegerson, for your comments.
We call next Joy Anderson. We do ask commenters to limit their comments to 2 to 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
Hello, this is Joy Anderson from Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So first of all, I just wanted to say that I can see that the EQB staff put a lot of time into this mandatory categories report, and they put a lot of time into gathering public input for it. And importantly, the public put a lot of time and effort into making the comments that they did make on this. Because of that, we're really disappointed not to see more recommendations for changes based on the robust public input that was gathered. And we're concerned that the recommendations that are made are not going to get implemented. So first, we were really disappointed to not see some key recommendations that drew a lot of public concern and that were sufficiently specific in order to be able to be implemented. Specifically, there was a recommendation about drainage improvement projects that DNR itself actually recommended. There's a bunch of public interest in water appropriations. I believe there were 80 comments asking for thresholds to be changed for water appropriations, as this is going to be a more and more concerning topic as time and climate change go on. And then there were a lot of suggestions related to mining as well that were specific and that could be implemented. And none of these have been added to mandatory categories report. We ask that they be added. Next, we were pleased to see recommendations on anaerobic digesters, on air pollution, and on feedlots. And we ask for the language on those to be strengthened. Now hearing Kayla talk about the recommendations, about how all of the recommendations are really just a starting step for consideration, for further action. I think that there's been a lot of discussion of these things already. There are specific recommendations that could be made, and we would ask for the EQB to actually make those changes and make those solid recommendations. We'd also like to see some sort of plan for moving these forward. This is a legislative report, but EQB does not need the legislative permission to move forward with these changes. As some of the commenters have been saying, a lot of these suggestions have been in play for a long time and have not moved forward. In the report itself, it notes in several places that changes have been recommended for quite a while and that were in the previous mandatory report and were not made. So we would ask that the language on those be strengthened and that there actually be a plan to move these things forward so they don't just languish in reports every year. Third, with respect to the decision criteria for ordering an EIS, EQB actually asked for ideas on this. So saying that they are outside the scope of the mandatory categories report is a little confusing to me when EQB specifically asked for recommendations on those. And we'd like to see some sort of forward movement on that as well. Again, EQB did a good job of gathering public comment, but gathering public comment is not an end in itself. It needs to be transformed into action. Otherwise, people lose faith in the public process, and you are hearing some of that frustration today. So I'd ask that the EQB make the changes that we have recommended to the mandatory categories report. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, Joy Anderson, for your comments.
Our
Colleen, looks like we
final-
have one more. Yeah, thank you.
Sophia Patain, you may start.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. My name is Sophia Patain. I am the Community Engagement Director for Water Legacy. Earlier this year, I attended the EQB meeting on May 15th to hear the discussion of public engagement during the comment period for mandatory categories. I recall Commissioner Kessler noting the energy and interest around this topic from the public, including her desire to make sure people continue to stay engaged with this work. At the same time, I also recall Commissioner Strawman expressing her concerns about feedback from the public, noting that she wanted to see institutional, presumably DNR, knowledge being used to separate what was a concern about a project or set of projects versus a broader issue that EQB could address in this report. It was clear from these comments at the time that the DNR did not support the public feedback shared with the EQB to strengthen environmental review. And at the same meeting, we were told that the public should expect a draft of the report in late summer to see if their comments were reflected in that version of the report. In the actual draft report, however, I believe public comment has been deflected. None of the recommendations that Water Legacy and over 170 other commenters made were taken by the EQB. This has clearly, as you have heard today and as others have expressed, not gone unnoticed. If one or a few perspectives from a board member can squash all recommendations provided by the public, I believe it undermines the public input process and the work of EQB staff. This is a disservice to everyone who took time and put effort into sharing actionable recommendations with the EQB. Public trust in this process hinges on the EQB board honoring meaningful public engagement and supporting staff in making those recommendations for action based on that public feedback. This is a missed opportunity to strengthen environmental review. We expected a transparent process that valued public comments, and we've observed the opposite. EQB must do better. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sophia Patain. I'm not seeing any other hands on the Teams call. Do we have anyone else here who would like to make comment? Do we have anyone in the room?
No one in the room.
All right. Okay, thank you for those comments during the comment period. Before we conclude this agenda item, are there any ARIS members that have further discussion or direction to offer regarding the draft report? All right, Member Nelson, please.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask if staff could respond to some of the concerns about public comment and their consideration of them in the report, and possibly a placeholder later for when the commissioners come back to the meeting for the same.
All right, thank you, Member Nelson. Do you want the staff to respond right now, or are you looking for a response to be formulated and delivered later?
Given the time frame that the report is due in December, I would like a little bit now.
Okay, sure. So let's see, Kayla, others, are y'all available to take back to the table and respond to Member Nelson's requests?
Chair Bauer-Kemper, this is Colleen, and I'll start while Kayla is going up to the table.
Okay, thank you.
I'm thankful for the discussion that we've had here today, and it's good to hear from the public. We did ask for the public's comments throughout this process, which is unique, and it has not typically been included in the report in the past. And I think that has made it a different procedure for how to incorporate everything into the mandatory category report. And I think that Kayla mentioned that some of the items are maybe outside the scope of the traditional rules or scoping of the mandatory category report. And so there are alternatives for us to also be looking at some of the comments that came in, and we can look at them through, as Kayla mentioned, our continuous improvement process. And I think, it's good for us to get this feedback. So I'll turn it over to Kayla to see if she has anything to add. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Chair.
thanks, Colleen.
Thank you, Colleen. And I would just reiterate that I really appreciate everybody's time and input, and I know that it takes a lot of time and effort to provide comment. And we hear you and we appreciate you being here and providing that. And there will be other opportunities to look at this draft, and we are going to take that feedback to heart. We have definitely reviewed all of the comments, and we are working with our co-authoring team to help make sure that ideas do not get lost and that they will be filtered into other processes in the future as well and considered there. And I just want to invite everyone to, please reach out to us and have conversations with us directly if you feel like that would be helpful. And I would, be happy to dive into specific comments with you more and think about alternative routes that those comments could take if they don't appear in the report and are not given as much space in the report as you'd like to see. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Kayla. Member Nelson, any follow-ups to that conversation?
No, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Member Hintz.
Yeah, just to respond to some of the comments that I heard, and this is really for staff and thinking about the timeline of this document. Is it possible before the next board meeting to insert some of those public comments and suggestions into the categories, not necessarily to be published with the full report? I don't know the requirements well enough around that, but in a way that board members can easily see where those recommendations were made for specific changes within the context of the full report. Is that something that could be done almost as a kind of an internal draft, just so that we could have a more robust discussion around it?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm entirely understanding the question. Sorry.
Sure. So one of the comments made was that the public members should, or that the board members should all be aware of the specific requests and public comment for each category where there were actions suggested but not included in the report. And I'm just wondering what opportunity we as board members have to review those kind of line by line with within the mandatory categories report. Is that clear?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, we have all that information. It's all public. It's all in a spreadsheet. We can absolutely share that. A lot of the comments we received were on Engagement HQ. That's a platform we can share on as well. That was all public. So I think that there's 700 comments, but if it's valuable and transparent to do that, that's something that we could definitely provide.
All right, thank you, Member Hintz, and thank you, Kayla. I have a follow-up question myself regarding that. Are those comments cross-referenced to the categories?
In the way that we have it on our spreadsheet, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Other comments or guidance from ARIS members? All right, thanks to the public members, for providing commentary. Thank you, Kayla and the staff. Thank you, Colleen, for the presentation and engaging in the conversation. We'll take a brief break now before we transition into the next agenda item, which is discussion of the climate calculator and data sources. So that'll be a 5-minute break. We'll start back up at 2:20. Don't leave the call though, just a brief break.
How's it going?
Colleen, Steph, are we ready there in the room to continue on with the meeting? Colleen, when y'all are ready, unmute the room and let us know. All right, we will get back into the meeting here as soon as the folks in the main room are ready. They'll unmute and we'll restart. Stephanie, are you able to hear me? Not confident that they're hearing me in the room. Let's see. Member Hens, Member Nelson, are y'all able to hear me?
This is Member Nelson. I can hear you.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Not sure if they can hear us there in the room. Colleen, are y'all ready to go? If so, unmute and say hello.
Okay. Let me see. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, are y'all able to hear us there in the room? Are we ready to get back on track?
Chair, yes, sorry, we had an extra mute on that we were not aware of.
Okay, yeah, we thought we might have been continuing on without you, which wouldn't be terribly functional. Wouldn't be terribly functional because the next item we need to hear from Steph. So welcome back everyone from that break. As you know, next on the agenda is a conversation about the climate calculator and the data sources associated with it. And Steph Aho is here to provide us insight. Thank you, Steph. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to start by thanking everybody for being here today. My name is Steph Aho. I'm the greenhouse gas data analyst on the EQB staff. And like the chair said, I'm here to talk about where we are in this greenhouse gas emissions calculator process. Today, I'll be talking about starting off with the timeline and the calculator team just to get us oriented, what is motivating this calculator project, the methodology and scope that we have defined that are outlined in ICF's memo, as well as the user inputs and embedded assumptions that they have laid out. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's expected with that memo and how we're reviewing it. And then we'll finish up with a couple of discussion questions and comments. So today's takeaways are sort of in line with that outline. We want you to make sure that you understand at the end of this presentation what we're trying to accomplish with this project, what parts of the project lifecycle are included. So I was here and talked about this in July, and there were a lot of questions around what do you mean by lifecycle assessment? And so I'm going to address this in this presentation. We want you to understand what emission sources are included and what's not included in this first phase of the project. What is expected of a calculator user? So these are the project proposers that will come to the calculator with information and expect the calculator to output a greenhouse gas emissions number that will answer question 18 that I'll talk about in a bit. And then we're going to talk a little bit about who's reviewing the draft memo and what that process is, and where we're going next with it, because it's going to get exciting pretty soon. This here is the calculator team that is working on this project. The EQB contracted with ICF to build this calculator, and the EQB will have final approval on the tool itself, as well as any documentation that comes along with it. At the end, this will include a user guide and a guide that says what is and is not in the calculator, so that users know upfront what their expected output will be and what the gaps will be in that output. And then we have ICF here. They are a contractor. They are responsible for this whole scoping and methodology process, as well as constructing the calculator, and they will design that user guide and documentation that I talked about. And they are also responsible for convening the experts, which are our technical advisory team. And this team is comprised of experts from several state agencies, as well as a few public members. And they are really helping us determine the correct direction to go in for this project. They are our data experts, looking at what data sources are available, what holes in the data might exist, and how we might fix our assumptions to get around some of those data gaps. And they were instrumental in determining the scope of this project. So here's our project timeline. We started in March 2024, and now we are in September. So we've been talking about this calculator for 6 months. And this was the time frame that we have allowed for the methodology and scoping process. We are extending that a little bit into October, just so that we have time to incorporate the feedback from the latest version of the draft memo and the feedback that we gather here today. We are also in the middle of the assessing data sources process, and there are still data sources coming in that we are looking at with ICF and our technical advisory team to assess how those might make the calculator more robust. We are about ready to start constructing the tool, which is, for me, the exciting part. Like I said, we've been talking about it for 6 months, and so it'll be nice to actually put some of those things that we've been talking about into practice and get a calculator tool that we can start testing in late winter. And then in the springtime, ICF will also be writing that documentation and final report, which are both that, along with the tool, is due in June 2025. So before we can get into how we are constructing this calculator tool, it's important that we all understand what is motivating this tool. It's a big project, and so there better be a big motivation behind it. And here it is in blue, question 18 from the environmental assessment worksheet. This is a really dense technical question, and it's not hard to imagine a project proposer seeing this question and getting overwhelmed by everything that they need to bring to the table to answer it in a really robust way. The question has inherent challenges in it that lead to sometimes incomplete answers that are missing key emission factors and sources. And so there's a strong need to make this process more efficient, effective, and consistent for those project proposers, and help guide them through the intricacies of this question. So to start making a calculator, it's important to define a clear methodology. And so when we were looking at this with ICF, we wanted to answer the question of how are we going to construct this calculator in the most complete and reasonable way. And we came up with 2 important points here. The calculator will be as simple and easy to use for project proposers. And it will also take on a life cycle assessment approach to quantifying emissions. So I will get into what it means for the calculator to be easy to use and simple. So this is our basic calculator. That didn't work. Okay, sorry. Sorry, so here's the methodology slide I was talking about. We're a few slides behind. These are the 2 points here that I just talked about. The calculator is going to be easy to use, and it's going to use a life cycle assessment. And so if you do one more, okay, here's our calculator flow. The calculator has a very basic function flow. So you input data, the calculator calculates things, and there's output. So the data that the user needs to bring to the calculator will be information they know or that is easily available to them. They shouldn't have to go and go through a bunch of math that they don't understand to get answers out to put into the calculator itself. The calculator will be doing that for them. It'll have built-in data assumptions that are data-based, built-in default assumptions that are data-based. And this is where the tech advisory team is really helping us refine these assumptions. And then the user inputs and the assumptions will be put into equations within the calculator to convert them into emissions numbers that we will put into the EAW form for question 18. And just some important notes here on this calculator flow. The definition between user inputs and default assumptions is a little fuzzy in some instances. There are some default assumptions that can be overridden by a user if they're able to bring that information to the calculator. Some default assumptions can also have variations within them. So if a project proposer is also already implementing mitigation strategies that would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, they'll be able to choose some default assumptions that will reflect that and give them credit for that in their EAW form. Rebecca. And so I want to get back to this life cycle assessment definition. As I said in July, there were a lot of questions about this. And so just to orient ourselves, and remind ourselves, the goal of the LCA is to compare a full range of environmental effects of products, projects, and services by quantifying inputs and outputs and the material flows and assessing how these flows affect the environment. And so for our life cycle assessment, we plan to look at the entire lifespan of a project and all of its phases. Those are construction, operation, and decommissioning. We also are including all upstream, downstream, direct, and indirect emissions, including those outside of Minnesota's boundaries. And when defining what our life cycle assessment is, I think it's important to define what it is not. So we are not doing an ISO LCA. An ISO is the International Organization of Standards. For an LCA, they put forth a rigorous set of criteria that an LCA has to meet, and these are more for studies and inventories. Our tool is going to provide a best estimate to project proposers, so we don't need to quite meet the rigor that an ISO LCA lays out. But in the documentation for the calculator, we will be upfront with what is not included in our life cycle assessment. And then we are also not a greenhouse gas inventory. A greenhouse gas inventory defines a time period and borders that define what the emission number is going to be. So for instance, the MPCA greenhouse gas inventory for Minnesota defines the borders as those of Minnesota. So emissions are those within the Minnesota borders, which we are not doing. All emissions, whether or not they occur in Minnesota, will be part of the life cycle assessment for these projects that are using the calculator. And then I just want to mention, currently the EAW guidance does use the language of scope 1, 2, and 3. So this language is laid out by the EPA for greenhouse gas inventories. And as I just said, we are not doing an inventory. So we are going to use the language that I talked about before, that construction, operation, decommissioning, the upstream, downstream, direct, and indirect language. Now, this change in language does not mean that we are not covered by the current EAW guidance. The calculator does still conform to the existing guidance, and so it doesn't need to be updated. at this time. But the language and the guidance will be updated at the same time to incorporate the calculator once it's done. So we're talking next summer timeframe for that update to make everything consistent. But again, we are not changing what is actually being asked of project proposers within the guidance. So now we've defined our methodology, simple calculator, life cycle assessment. We're ready to get into scoping. And it became pretty clear when we looked at all of the mandatory categories and all of the emission sources that we were not going to be able to do them within the time frame we had with the resources available. So our scoping question became, what should we include in the initial calculator? That's the calculator that's going to be delivered in June 2025. And again, we came to some important conclusions here. We are going to have quantitative emissions for question 18A and 18B3. We are only going to have qualitative mitigation strategies for this first phase for 18B1 and 18B2. And we are also not able to include all emission sources, and I'll get in the next few slides to what emission sources we will be including. We do plan in the future to expand the included emission sources and also provide quantitative mitigation calculations, but those will be after June 2025. So when it came to deciding which emission sources we would include and which we would not, we had to go through an evaluation of emission sources to meet these 5 criteria. And I talked about more in depth about this in July. To make these criteria, we looked at historical EAWs to figure out which categories might be used most often. We grouped mandatory categories to determine commonalities of emission sources where we could get a lot of bang for our buck by getting an emission source nailed down. And we also looked at the data availability and applicability to determine what assumptions we could actually reasonably put into the model. And from that, we came up with these 5 criteria. We want to be able to clearly define our emission sources. We want to be able to accurately quantify them. We want them to apply to multiple project types if possible. We want the emission sources that we have in the calculator in this first phase to represent a large percentage of a project's overall greenhouse gas emissions. We don't want to be chasing down things that are only 1 or 2% if our resources could be better spent elsewhere. And we are weighting direct emissions slightly higher than indirect, though indirect are still included. And so here is a stoplight chart. This one is for the construction phase. And in construction, you can see that we are including all of the construction emissions that we have identified. And there are a couple here that are at lower priority. And they will be included if resources allow. At this point, they are within the scope of this calculator phase, but they will be the first on the chopping block if things should change. And then moving on to operation. Here we have high priority emission sources and low priority emission sources again, but we also have things that we have designated as future emission sources that will not be included in the calculator that will be finalized in June 2025. We just don't have the resources to tackle all of these. And these were the ones based on those 5 criteria that were determined to be the least beneficial to include in this first round. Now, we have taken the feedback that we got in July and talked with ICF further. You'll see a couple of those future ones include an asterisk. And that is indicating that for some mandatory categories, those emission sources will be included in this phase of the project. So for instance, in the use of products sold for a fuel pipeline, we will be including the emissions from that fuel, which is an important component of the overall greenhouse gas emissions for a pipeline. And so we're still working with ICF to really nail down which categories will get these additional sources included back in, but just know that we did look at that feedback and we are are including those back in where they are appropriate. And then for decommissioning, we have decided to move all of decommissioning emissions to future phases of the project. When a user comes to the calculator, the decommissioning phase is the phase they know the least about. And it's also the phase that is hardest to make really good assumptions for within the model. And so given the two levels of uncertainty we have there, we felt like this was not the best use of our resources, and it was better to put those resources into construction and operation emissions. But we will be looking at these in future phases of the calculator and future improvements. And so here is that stoplight chart summed up in one very nice figure. This is from ICF's scoping memo that is an attachment to the board packet for this meeting. And you can see here we just have operation and construction, and the emission sources in black are those that are included at high priority, and the emission sources in gray are those that are included in low priority. And if you want to read more about this figure and what went into it, that is in that ICF memo that is attached. And so now we have a scope and we have a methodology, and we need to start thinking about how users are going to use this calculator. And the ICF memo goes into great detail about how each emission source is going to be broken down into user inputs, built-in assumptions, and what equations are going to be used to derive an emission number from those inputs. I can't go through all 30 categories in the time I'm allotted, so we have chosen an example project here, which is a warehouse. So for a warehouse project, the user would be expected to bring to the calculator, for construction, they would just need to know the length of construction, the equipment type they're going to be using, the materials, and the project site location. For the operation phase, they need to know their building size and how much of that is cooled, what vehicle use they expect on site, the expected number of annual visitors and employees to their site, and where their generated waste goes, if they plan to use landfill or recycling or some proportion of those. And then we have built-in default assumptions to the calculator. And here you can see many emissions factors. There's emissions factors for construction, material, employee commuting, energy consumption. There's carbon stocks by land use type information built in. There's waste material emissions factors. For operation, we have energy use intensity, energy and electricity emissions factors, refrigerant leakage rates, vehicle miles traveled, waste generation rates. There's so much information here. And I want listeners to understand that currently to get a greenhouse gas emissions number at the level that we are going to be able to do with the calculator, the user would have to bring all of this information as well as the inputs I listed on the previous slide to the calculator or to their EAW form. So this is a lot of work that we are going to be taking off the plate of a project proposer, and it's the more technical components. So when I say we want to make this tool easy to use, this is what we're talking about: taking out the stuff that requires a lot of knowledge and skill, and asking the user to just bring what they know to the calculator. And so all of this is outlined in the scoping memo. It talks about the methodology, the scoping, and then it goes, as I said, into each emission source, and talks about what are the assumptions, what's the user input, and what equations are we using to calculate the emissions numbers. There's also a very helpful appendix, Appendix C, which takes a look at the mandatory categories and identifies the emission sources that would be expected to impact that category. And so you can reference that Appendix C table to go into the actual memo to see for your type of project what emission sources you would be expected to account for. So the scoping memo from ICF is an informational deliverable. We're going to release the final in early October. So there's a couple more rounds of edits to go through, and we will be incorporating the feedback that we get today into those edits. This is not a voting item, so we don't need to vote as a board to approve or reject the item. As I said, the memo does go into greater technical detail about the scope and methodology of the calculator, and we are going to be using it as a blueprint for tool construction. When we get into that construction, it is expected that unknown challenges are going to arise. This calculator is a super ambitious project. It's covering so many mandatory categories. As I said, there's over 30. It's something that hasn't been done before. So the challenges that come up may result in a reduction, most likely a reduction of scope. So while something in the memo may say that it's going to be included, if we end up not having the resources to include everything, some of those low priority items may be de-scoped. It's very, very, very unlikely that we would increase scope. So if we're saying that we're not including something within the memo, it's not going to magically show up later. And then this memo is a very dense technical document, and we have had our tech advisory team reviewing it and reviewing the components of it throughout the summer. Recently, we had subgroups convened from our tech advisory team based on the expertise of those tech advisory team members. We had 4 subgroups, and here's just a sample of the feedback that they gave us. So for the energy subgroup, they asked that we include more options to override assumptions and defaults. Those are those ones that would be defaults and assumptions, but if the user knows more information, they can override those with the information that they have. The energy group also asked that we potentially de-scope SF6 and fugitive coal emissions, given that they're being phased out. The team was not sure that that would be the best use of our resources, so we're looking into that currently. For the transportation subgroup, we needed to be a little bit more varied with our construction assumptions and give a few more options there to the user. And we needed to add some additional materials and sources for those materials. For the waste subgroup, we actually needed to add more assumptions for waste streams. Previously, we had been asking the user to bring in a lot of information about their waste streams, and it was pointed out that maybe the user won't have that. And so that doesn't go along with our ease of use mantra, and so we will be adding more assumptions about waste streams into those emission sources. And then we were also treating municipal and industrial wastewater the same, but it was pointed out that we probably need to treat industrial wastewater with different assumptions, and so we'll be adding that in. The final group was land use and agriculture, and they wanted to make sure that we were not adding too much greenhouse gas emissions for a land clearing operation. So some of that carbon will be sequestered in building materials, for instance, wood to go into a building. And that carbon should not count as an emission for against a project where they are clearing land. So we're going to add in the ability to sequester some of that carbon. And then we're also going to allow the flexibility in yearly animal counts and manure management as these things do change from year to year. And this is just a sample of the feedback that we got, but I put it up here as a sample to show you what sorts of comments we're getting and what discussion we're having. It's a very technical discussion, and they're a great asset to help us really nail down the finer points of this calculator. And at the bottom, the general feedback from every group was that they really liked this memo. They really liked the approach that we were taking with the calculator. They thought it was well organized and thorough. And they think the scope is reasonable given the resources that we have. And it's always nice to hear that experts like your work. So just to give everybody a little bit of confidence in what we're doing, our highly technical experts really liked it. But they're not the only people that we want feedback from. We certainly want feedback either today or in the future from EQB and ARIS. We want to leverage the expertise of the tech reps, particularly in the area of user experience, where they will have a lot to bring to the table. And we want to hear from the public because the public is also going to be a user group of this tool. To leave feedback, we've set up a space at Engagement HQ, and you can access that at engage.eqb.state.mn.us. It is live now, and it's a place where you can access that memo that I've been talking about from ICF. There's also a background memo there that I wrote to sort of orient you to their very technical memo. And you can read through those and then give your feedback. If you would like your feedback to be considered for the final version of the scoping memo being released in early October, we need that feedback by September 30th. We do appreciate feedback after that. We still want to hear from you if you don't make that September 30th date, but though the feedback received after that date will inform smaller decisions within the established scope. So we'll still be able to make finer decisions after the memo is finalized, but we won't be able to make large changes in scope. And so for our next steps, as I said, the final scoping memo is going to be released in early October, and then we get to start constructing the tool. And that process will continue for several months. But I do want to make sure that I point out there will be testing opportunities for the calculator in late winter. We expect to have a beta version of the calculator by then, and we want to stress test it. So if you want to be part of that process of testing the calculator, whether you're a state employee or a public member, leave a comment to that effect at the Engagement HQ site, and I will contact you to see how you can help with that process. We're going to start working on getting those testing groups together towards the end of October and early November. So finally, we've reached our discussion portion. Here are a few questions to lead the discussion. These are things I definitely want to hear about from you, but if there are any other comments or questions, feel free to ask them now, or you can email me later or access the Engagement HQ site as shown. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Steph. Appreciate that presentation and certainly the extensive work that it narrates for us. Are there any comments or questions, responses perhaps to these questions or otherwise from ARIS members? All right, Member Nelson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple thoughts for Stephanie, and then a couple thoughts for consideration by the subcommittee at some point that are kind of beyond the current calculator thing. But first of all, Stephanie, I followed the memo very well. I, again, am sort of happy with how you scoped it. Makes sense what you're rating as high. And to me, I do have a couple questions, or one question. The default data sources, how broadly are they accepted as the real numbers, or do you anticipate there may be a lot of desire for alternative inputs by project proposals?
Do you mean in terms of what the user inputs will be versus the data assumptions?
Data assumptions.
What is the variability in the data assumptions? I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
I guess my question would be is a lot of time data comes in a range, and depending on where you sit as looking at a project, you may choose to use the low end of the range or the high end of the range or the mid end of the range, or you may say that data source is not accurate, this other one is more accurate. do you anticipate that the data sources you have are broadly accepted as the correct ones, or do you think we're going to get people that are going to argue the data sources?
So I am fairly confident that we have got the right data sources to back up the assumptions that we are putting in the calculator. We have had our tech advisory team looking at this for months. They've brought a lot of data sources themselves to the table. This is not ICF's first rodeo with a calculator. They've never done something so broad, but they've done emissions calculators previously. So they are not unfamiliar with the data availability and sources that are utilized for projects like this. So I feel like we have the correct data sources to answer the questions. Now there will be some, as I said, some opportunity for variability within those assumptions that will be accessible by the user. So if the user feels like they're using very green concrete for their project, they will be able to choose emissions factors that reflect that. And the data sources will be there for each of the different variations that the user is able to access. We certainly, at this point, if there is a specific data concern after reading the memo, we definitely want to hear about it. We are still looking at data sources. We have the big important ones nailed down, but if there are a few nuances that you think would be beneficial for us to hear, I certainly, and this goes for anybody, I would certainly welcome that commentary. But I would say that I'm confident that we're going in the right direction and that our data decisions are defensible.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, a few follow-ups.
Yeah, please, thanks.
Second thing, I noticed you had mentioned that question 18 is fairly dense. I would just request that as you go through this process, if you see ways to improve that, to let us know. The form can be changed. So, and then larger question or comments for the subcommittee as a whole is, so a project proposer goes through and comes up with a number, 12 tons, something, whatever. My question is, what does that mean? I know that as I worked for a county that was an RGU, my board wouldn't understand what that meant. So I think we kind of need to have that conversation. Maybe that means some guidance, some benchmarks, some things need to be developed at some point. And further, when, my understanding is environmental review is supposed to inform permitting. So I'd like to hear at some point, how would these numbers that are going to be calculated inform the permitting? And that permitting, I think, is that done by the Air Pollution Control Agency for air permitting. And I think those would be a couple valuable pieces of information or things to talk about at some point. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Member Nelson. Any other comments, feedback, input, questions from ARIS members? Commissioner Daubenberger, please.
Can you hear me? Sorry about the background noise.
Yes, thank you. Coming through fine.
Thanks. Yeah, just a couple of comments or questions. And I spoke with Edie Duschler about this too, but for transportation projects, that has a tool that was developed in actually the federal administration. Our MICE tool. I'm standing for Minnesota, so it's tailored to Minnesota. We just want to make sure that we're not going to end up in this process with needing to use two tools. So if the current MICE tool gets incorporated into the this process, that's fine. But we already have a tool that has been approved and as well. So just want to be clear about that. But then the other thing is, with the group that edited the EAW sheet, convening group across different subgroups, I think would be good in this effort too, is what I'm hearing from our tech rep and those who've been involved with this, just to make sure that we're working across areas.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Daubenberger. Steph, do you have any commentary regarding either the relationship between the two tools or the structuring of the discussion?
So I can comment on the MICE issue. We are well aware of MICE and we love it a lot. We use it as a sort of benchmark for what we want our tool to be for other mandatory categories. We are certainly not trying to rewrite MICE within our model. And we would expect that for straight transportation projects, the MICE tool would still be the one to use. We will be including components of MICE within the calculator, the greenhouse gas emissions calculator, for projects where transportation is not the main focus, but is a component of the emission sources that are required for that project. So for instance, if you have a residential neighborhood going up and they need to do some assessment about their emissions related to their streets, we will have a component in there to use, so they don't need to use our calculator for one half of it and then go to MICE to use the transportation part. But if a project can be fully contained within MICE, then MICE is certainly a well-rounded defensible tool, and would not raise any eyebrows if we see it on an EAW as the source of emissions numbers. So we want to exist in harmony with MICE, and if there's any friction there, we certainly want to hear about it, because it's a great tool and we don't want to step on any toes or replace it in any way. And I don't have any commentary on the second one because unfortunately I couldn't hear much of it and I'm so sorry. If Commissioner Daubenberger would like commentary on that, maybe we can talk about that later through email or a separate discussion.
All right, thank you, Steph. Commissioner Daubenberger, I saw your hand go back up for a moment.
Sorry, I'll type in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments from ARIS members? Any questions, comments from other board members that have joined the meeting? All right, so we will open up now for public comment, structured similarly to how we did it with the last agenda item. If you would like to make public comment and you are on the Teams call, please raise your hand. If you've signed up in the room, we'll find out about that and proceed with those public comments. Do we have anyone in the room?
No, we don't have anyone in the room.
All right, so we'll take a second to see if we have anyone on the call raise their hand in order to offer public comment. If you're inclined to do so, better raise that hand now. I'm not seeing any hands. If anyone does see hands, tell me. All right. Doesn't appear that we have any public comment on this agenda item. One more opportunity, any ARIS members for further input or discussion? All right, thank you. It looks like we have our proper chair back in the room. Is that correct?
Member Bauer Kemper, I am back in the room with Commissioner Kessler. So I don't know if it's I don't know if proper chair is the right term, but sounded like you were doing more than a bang up job. So appreciate you taking the gavel. I will take it back if that is what you were asking.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. That'd be great. Thanks.
Excellent. So it looks like we are on to our final item, which is just closing and adjournment of this ARIS meeting. So I will.
Sorry, I didn't make a smooth
sorry.
transition. So I had only invited comment particular to the climate calculator.
Yep, Colleen was just pointing out the same thing. Sorry, and that is partially my fault for coming in the middle of this. So we are on item 6 of our agenda, which is public comment. So this is public comment on any item that was not discussed on the agenda today or had a specific public comment earlier. So do we have anyone in person who has signed up for that?
Here we do not.
Okay. Is there anyone online who would like to make a public comment in this subcommittee forum here today? If so, I'd ask that you please raise your hand at this time. I will make one more ask. I did not mean to discourage public comment by whizzing past this item earlier. So now would be a great time to raise your hand, or it would be the only time actually to raise your hand if you would like to make a public comment.
Can I ask one question?
You may, Commissioner Sedler.
All right, sorry, having missed most of that. Can somebody explain what the next steps are for the calculator tool?
Sure.
Right. I know that you probably said that and I missed it.
So we've spent the last 6 months doing the scoping and methodology. It will be released in a final form in October. So we're going to take the feedback here, go through another round of edits or 2, and then release it in October. It's only an informational item, so no vote is needed. And then we're starting to construct the calculator, and it'll be great fun. We'll be testing it. It'll be a good time.
So iteratively kind of improving it as we go.
Yep, we expect in the January to March timeframe for there to be some opportunity for testing. So about January, hopefully we have a working calculator for at least some mandatory categories.
And I really apologize that you have to go first. I'm curious about opportunities to iteratively improve it and look at it as it goes.
Yep.
So thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Stephanie, for coming back and addressing that. All right, final call for any public comment for this session of the Environmental Review Implementation Subcommittee. Are you seeing anyone online? I am not seeing anyone online.
Chair, if I could briefly.
Yes, please, member.
I just wanted, thank you. I just wanted to note during the previous discussion of the climate calculator, Commissioner Daubenberger had some input and it's in the chat. And I know that we don't keep a proper record of the chat. So I'm just going to note that it says that the commissioner's second suggestion, it was a little tough for us to hear it in the moment, reads as follows: seeing the separate subgroups for the Technical Advisory Committee on this tool development, it's requested to continue to have larger convening groups like the Climate Technical Committee that established the EAW edits be involved. So just wanted to make sure to give that voice beyond the chat so it's on the recording and on the record. Apologies for the interruption. Thanks.
No, Member Bauer-Kemper, thank you for that, so that we do get it on the record. And I cannot see the chat from where I sit, so that's extremely helpful. I am not seeing any hands raised. I am, now that the chat is up, not seeing any more items in the chat that we should read into the record. So I think now we are on item 7 of our agenda, which is the closing and adjournment. And so I will say thank you again to both Kayla and Stephanie for your presentations today. Colleen, thank you for stepping into the executive director's typical role today Member Bauer Kemper, thank you for sharing the chair duties today. I probably just should have let you keep going till the end of the meeting. And thank you to all of the other ARIS and board members for participating in today's discussion. At this time, I would ask for a motion to adjourn.
I can make that motion.
Motion made by Commissioner Kessler. Is there a second?
Second by Nelson.
Thank you, Member Nelson. So we now have a motion and a second. All those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion carries and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.